Deputy Thomas Pringle.
Thank you, Seán Crowe, and I suppose it's a continuation from the previous question, but I think it's very, very important that we discuss this here in the House. And it's basically just whether the European Union and the Council will encourage the European Union to engage directly with President Maduro of Venezuela rather than with the fake president of the country, and whether what the Council's view is in relation to that.
The Taoiseach, and I believe your group, Taoiseach.
Well, I've semi-answered this question already.
Will you just confirm what questions you're taking?
Oh, sorry. I think we're proposing to take questions 6, 7, 26, and 27 together. Is that right?
Agreed.
So that gives me a bit of time to read quite a full response into the record. As I said in answering the previous question, Venezuela is currently experiencing the worst social, humanitarian, political and economic crisis in its history. This crisis is having a dire impact on the population and has resulted in mass migration, affecting countries in the region and overall regional stability. An estimated 3 million Venezuelan immigrants and refugees have left Venezuela in the last 3 years, with the majority going to neighbouring countries. We are concerned about the unfolding humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, where the needs of the population are acute. Ireland is strongly committed to the humanitarian principles of neutrality, impartiality and independence, and supports the EU's international contact group, which has been specifically set up to try and ensure that they can bring about peaceful and democratic intervention. Ireland, along with our EU partners, has called on numerous occasions for the government of President Maduro to acknowledge the full scale of the humanitarian crisis. The refusal by the government of President Maduro to allow humanitarian aid into the country over the weekend resulted in violence and confrontation, particularly on the Colombia and Brazilian border. We condemn this violence, and I fully support the EU statement on the 24th of February, which calls on government authorities to show restraint, avoid the use of force and allow the entry of aid into the country. The statement also reiterates the EU's commitment to increase humanitarian assistance from its current levels of over 60 million for Venezuelans in need, in line with humanitarian principles. As well as addressing the humanitarian situation in the country, the EU's international contact group aims to facilitate a peaceful, democratic solution to the crisis by seeking to put in place conditions to allow for a political process to take place. The contact group had its first meeting, as I said earlier, on the 7th of February. A technical mission co-chaired by the EU and Uruguay travelled to Caracas last week in order to look at how the EU can assist with next steps and preparations for fresh presidential elections, and to assess how best to organise the delivery of aid. I very much welcome and support the high priority which the EU gives to this issue and the coordinated action which it's undertaking. Likewise, I fully subscribe to the EU common position outlined in late January, when the EU made clear that if no announcement regarding fresh elections were to be made during a specified period, then the EU would take further actions, including regarding the issue of recognition of the country's interim leadership and consideration of additional EU-targeted sanctions. On the 3rd of February, in the absence of an announcement by President Maduro to call fresh elections in Venezuela, a number of EU member states began issuing statements recognising Juan Guaido as interim president of Venezuela. On the 6th of February, I joined the vast majority of other EU member states in acknowledging and supporting Mr Guaido, President of the democratically elected National Assembly, as President ad interim of Venezuela in order for him to call free and fair democratic presidential elections. We currently share this position with 24 other EU member states. Ireland continues to call for a negotiated, democratic, peaceful solution that can bring political stability and address the people's needs. I will continue to engage on this with our EU and regional partners at the highest level. Ireland strongly rejects the suggestion of any possible military intervention in Venezuela. Any solution to this crisis must be both peaceful and democratic. So, Deputy, this has been an incremental position where an unfolding humanitarian crisis needed and needs an international response. The response to that has been a collective one by the EU. The US has taken a somewhat different approach, but the objective of all countries, whether they be from South America, North America or the EU, is to try and ensure that there is a democratic solution to this humanitarian crisis and that it doesn't continue to deteriorate in a way that results in violence.
Pringle.
Members, so that there'll be different supplementary questions, and hopefully the Taoiseach will cover them all. It's interesting, Taoiseach, just how we're so active in support for the unelected so-called president of Colombia, and that we let so many other humanitarian crises go right across the world, and Libya, Iraq, Yemen, South Sudan, and it's endless. But we're very active in this one. I wonder, is it we're going to look at as a deal for us going to be to provide a dairy or something in Colombia when we overthrow this government, like the European Union with the European Union? Just in relation, you mentioned that the European EU delegation went to Caracas to discuss how to help in Colombia. Who did they actually talk with? Did they talk to the Venezuelan government to see how they could help? And you talk about aid and that and this crisis. This crisis didn't start when your man took over, became the Americans' puppet in Colombia. This crisis was ongoing for many years before that, and American sanctions on Colombia were in place for many years before that, but I didn't hear you or any of Europe speaking out in relation to that and the difficulties that it was causing for the Colombian people. Perhaps you'd comment on that now as well. Thanks.
Well, maybe perhaps we could take all the supplementaries. The next two tabled a question was, are you happy with that?
Well, I don't know what
yeah, okay. Deputy Richard Boyd Barrett, the same vein, and we have some time.
Standards and hypocrisy of your government and the European Union on this is absolutely stunning. Saudi brings Yemen to the brink of famine, kills Jamal Khashoggi, tortures and abuses civil rights activists. We won't even ask them to visit their prisons. In Venezuela, where the regime that came to power under Chavez, from the moment it came to power, America was trying to sabotage it economically, and the wealthy inside Venezuela were trying to sabotage it, despite its democratic mandate. Now, since then, has Maduro done things that are wrong, over-centralised power, repressed legitimate opposition? Yes, he has, and I condemn him and criticise him for that. But to say that the crimes he's committed are anything even close to what Saudi Arabia is doing would be preposterous. And to deny the fact that the US has an oil-driven agenda in that country and throughout the region and has actively sought to sabotage the democratic wishes of the people of Venezuela from the outset, for you to deny that is hypocrisy, denial and dishonesty at the most enormous level. America is trying to control its backyard and in particular control some of the biggest oil reserves in the world. You know it.
Deputy Catherine Connolly, who's the next step tabled.
I'm afraid I'd have to agree, Minister. Actually, hypocrisy jumps out. And you talk about humanitarian crisis. The actual cost of the sanctions greatly exceeds the cost of the humanitarian aid that's going in. And there's a serious question about that humanitarian aid and where it's coming from. South Sudan has been mentioned, Yemen, Libya, Iraq, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, and I can mention many more. And you're clapping yourself on the back because this was an incremental decision. So it was a slow decision to become one of the best boys in the European class, rather than standing up with our neutral voice for peace. And the constitution in Venezuela that was brought in 1999 has the mechanisms within it for leading to a peaceful solution. And if we were genuinely interested in bringing peace to Venezuela and not taking oil out of it or backing up America as they take oil out of it, would we be standing up as a neutral country and setting in place the means to bring peace to that country? The hypocrisy is simply appalling, Minister. I see why you stuck to your script, because I think if you moved from your script, you would have been in serious trouble with your own conscience in relation to this matter.
Deputy Seán Crowe, who has also tabled a question.
I think, Taoiseach, your announcement that the Irish Government recognised Juan Guaido as President of Venezuela is an attempt to legitimise a coup. You're saying that you came to this position on an incremental basis, but unfortunately, if you look at South America, that's how coups happen, on an incremental approach, and that has been the history in that region. And you could look at other countries that you could say there was a coup happening. But you say you have a difficulty with the election. The election in May 2018 didn't have to happen. It happened on the basis that there was a call from the opposition parties in Venezuela for that election. The election went ahead. Many parties decided not to go ahead. Guaido didn't put himself forward in that election. President Maduro won that election. He's the legitimate president in that region. There's difficulties in that country, certainly, but by Ireland coming out with this statement, and particularly this statement in relation, as you were going to Washington and meeting with President Trump, and also under pressure from NATO's European members, I think it's a worrying development in Irish foreign policy. So instead of the damaging recognition of an undemocratic coup, you should have declared that Ireland will support the efforts of Mexico and Uruguay to find a peaceful political solution. So what will you do now in relation to it? Are you supporting that process? And if you are, why aren't you? Why isn't your officials involved in supporting that initiative?
To respond to the 4 supplementaries.
First of all, the EU is coordinating with Uruguay, Deputy. That's exactly what's happening. The EU has set up a contact group in order to focus on peaceful democratic solutions here. That's the contribution that the EU is making. And I mean, you seem to be focused solely on the US approach here. And I think it's important to say that the EU has made its own statements and made its own decisions in relation to Venezuela and how we should respond to a totally unacceptable deterioration of conditions that has resulted in 3 million refugees leaving Venezuela, which is destabilising its neighbour states as well. So this isn't just an issue about Venezuela itself. It's the impact of what is happening in Venezuela on neighbouring states and on the region. And even on the EU, the number of Venezuelans that have come to Spain, for example, is a very significant number in the last 3 years. So whether we like it or not, this is an issue that is impacting on everybody, and the EU, as a significant contributor to the foreign policy debate, needed to take a position. And unlike you, Deputy, I don't recognise, and the EU collectively doesn't recognise, that the last presidential election was free and fair and that President Maduro was legitimately elected. So they don't accept that those elections were run in a free and fair way without intimidation. And so what we are trying to do now is ensure that there is an interim mechanism that allows for the facilitation of free and fair presidential elections. When people talk about Yemen and Iraq and the DRC and Libya and so on, we talk about those issues all the time. I talk about those issues all the time. I was speaking specifically about some of those issues in the Human Rights Council in Geneva this week. So, you know, less of the lecturing, please, in relation to comparing crises. There are very legitimate and very, very real concerns in many countries across the world. But that doesn't mean that we should ignore something and the scale of what's happening potentially in a hugely influential country in Latin and South America. And so the EU has tried, and on many occasions the EU is not able to actually respond to crises like this with one voice. In this instance, they were able to do it. And the EU is often criticised for not being able to have a collective influence and impact for the better in different parts of the world. We're trying to respond to that criticism in relation to Venezuela here. And so, you know, if you look at the humanitarian response that the EU is trying to provide to Yemen, yesterday Ireland committed €5 million to humanitarian assistance in Yemen. Minister Cannon did just yesterday. So, let's not start comparing all of these areas. But what we are trying to do here is be part of an EU collective effort to build pressure to try to deliver a democratic solution. And there has been a recognition of a temporary president in order to facilitate that, as opposed to anything more permanent than that. But this isn't about overthrowing governments. It's about trying to facilitate an election that can allow the Venezuelan people decide what kind of government they want.
I have to give 4 brief supplementaries in that order. Richard Boyd Barrett.
By recognising Guaido, who is
Sorry, my apologies.
Sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead, Deputy.
A far right-wing opponent of the government, you have essentially given the green light to civil war and to external intervention. If you had gone and talked to the government over there, different parties, talked about, assistance to Venezuela on the humanitarian front, no problem, right? What you've done, and Europe has done, has gone in and given legitimacy to people who are trying to organise a coup against the Venezuelan constitution, and in the context where Trump, God save us, Donald Trump, is straining at the leash to send the US military in to get oil, and you know it. And you have legitimised that. And I tell you, you will be responsible for the consequences.
Thank you.
That's the truth. That's what you've done.
Deputy Pringle.
Thanks, Seán Crowe. Minister,
Minister will have an opportunity to respond. Deputy Pringle.
Minister, maybe you would answer my first question was in relation to the EU delegation that's in Caracas. Have they been in contact with the Venezuelan government, and are they meeting with the Venezuelan government? It seems so they're the people that you can organise relief with, or are you simply just doing it with the so-called?
Just, Minister, in the first instance, I'd like to just put on record that my colleague, Deputy Maureen O'Sullivan, you've accused her of not being interested in humanitarian aid. And I know you probably didn't mean that, but it's certain. You did actually, Minister, no interest. You said she had no interest in humanitarian aid. In relation to the issue, my question specifically was in relation to the statement made by the UN rapporteur who was appointed, and he made a statement in January. Coercion, whether military or economic, must never be used to seek a change in government in a sovereign state. The use of sanctions by outside powers to overthrow an elected government is in violation of all norms of international law. It's a long statement, and it goes on. That's the UN Special Rapporteur in a specific area, in the area of human rights. Now, you're standing here and telling us that you're happy that there's an EU collective voice. I'm certainly not happy. We're a neutral country with a proud record, up to very recently, where people would listen to us. If we were seriously interested, Minister, and if you were, we would be talking, as has been said, to the people on the ground in Venezuela. We're picking and choosing our countries depending on what Mr. Trump wants, because it's difficult to call him president, but he is, and what the EU wants. And oil is top of the agenda here. Now, it's appalling to come in here and tell us that the EU and you have a collective voice in relation to this, standing over sanctions that are going to cause a lot more damage. We know it from Iraq. Sanctions cause more distress, more upset and more human suffering on the ground than anything else.
Deputy Seán Crowe.
There's a very real risk of a conflict in Venezuela. We do know that US troops are gathering in neighbouring countries, so the situation is getting more difficult and more difficult. You're saying about the situation within Venezuela itself. A part of that is down to the fact that there was shortages and everything else, and the Venezuelan government would say that those shortages were created by outside influences. I think your statements are simply facilitating extremists who are hell-bent on forcing the legitimate president out of office for their own ideological reasons, and they'll stop at nothing to do that. I think your declaration in relation to Guaido undermines democratic norms. I think it's also a violation of international sovereignty and marks a dark day in Irish foreign affairs policy. And I think this will create a precedent for the future. And I think that's where I'm really worried about, that this is a step that I think we're out of step with democratic norms, and clearly the direction that Ireland is going in relation to supporting this. You're saying that you're reluctant to go down this road, but I think it's a worrying development.
2 minutes to respond to the floor, and 2 minutes only.
Well, first of all, in case there was any confusion earlier, I certainly wouldn't ever suggest that Maureen O'Sullivan isn't interested in humanitarian aid. She's one of the people in this House who I have huge regard for on issues like this. So just to put that on the record, she has a long and distinguished contribution to make in relation to humanitarian assistance in lots of conflicts and difficult situations. So, but let me put that to bed. If that was taken from what I said earlier, it wasn't what I meant. In relation to, can I just say, you know, the motivation behind any decision that I've taken or the Irish government has taken is about trying to support democratic decision-making, Deputy, not the opposite to that. Many people on the other side of this House put me under pressure all the time for Ireland to do more to intervene when democracy is being undermined, or when human rights are being abused, or when humanitarian relief can't get in. How much criticism have I taken in this House for not speaking up in a stronger way in terms of getting humanitarian relief into Yemen? But when I say it in relation to Venezuela, you criticise me because you are recognising a president in Venezuela that I don't believe to be democratically and fairly elected. So there's hypocrisy here coming from the other side of the House, I would suggest. What we have tried to do here is work with EU partners and other neutral member states. Sweden has taken the same position. Austria has taken the same position. Malta has taken the same position. Other countries that are neutral within the European Union, that aren't aligned militarily, have taken the same position, and most of them took the same position before we did, actually, in relation to trying to have a collective effort and a collective message coming from the European Union that we want a peaceful resolution to this, not a violent one, that we totally reject any suggestion that there could be military incursions into Venezuela, and that we continually appeal to all involved, including Mr. Maduro, to be able to facilitate a peaceful and democratic solution to this crisis that has driven millions of people out of his own country.
Deputy Tommy Bruhan.